times, and I've worked there. It's not the same as when I'm in Norwich, and I'm, very close to the church, and too far from Stansted either. So it's, but it's interesting. I was saying to Maria earlier that it looks as though in this lockdown I should be doing more spiritualist work than I did before we had the lockdown.
And you were doing a fair bit before.
Well, on and off.
On and off, on and off. So I remember you explaining to me that you were born in Liverpool. Is that right? Did I remember that correctly?
I'm a Scouser, yeah.
A Scouser. And born into a family of spiritualists.
Yes, indeed, I was. And it's quite interesting the way my paternal grandfather became a spiritualist. He was quite a character, really. I never knew him. He died before I was born. But he was a real character. He was orphaned when he was quite young. And he was brought up by an uncle who wasn't very kind to him. And when he left school at 12 or 14 or whatever it was, they put him to work in the slate mines or the slate quarries in North Wales, because he was born in Derwen, which is near Corwen in North Wales. And he was so fed up with all this, he decided he'd run away, and he walked from there to Liverpool. Wow. I don't know how long it took him, but I'm sure it took him several days. And then he settled down. Interestingly enough, the accommodation he first had was in a road called Brasenose Road in Bootle. And years later, my first job after leaving school was with a company in Brasenose Road. So there was a nice little link there. But he was an ardent Methodist, taught in Sunday school, was a member of the elders and all this. And somebody at work lent him a pamphlet written by Emma Hardinge Britton about how to contact the spirit people.
Yes.
He read this and he thought, well, I thought my friend at work was a bit more intelligent than this. It's all a load of nonsense. And yet he was a fair-minded man, and he said, well, how can I really say that unless I try what's suggested here? So one Sunday morning, he didn't go to church. Instead, he sat with his 7-year-old son, my Uncle Robert, at the kitchen table. And they followed the instructions. They said a prayer, and they sat. And of course, they were expecting the table to move. Well, it was a great big kitchen table. And that didn't happen, of course. But what did happen was that my uncle, 7 years of age, fell asleep, or at least so my grandfather assumed. Yeah. And he was going to shake him to wake him up, when he remembered that in the pamphlet it had said, if that happens, don't try to wake them up, but give them a pencil and some paper and see if they write anything. So he did that, and my uncle, and don't forget he was only 7, he started writing. And he ended up having written quite a bit in Welsh. Now, Welsh was my grandfather's native tongue, but my uncle was born in Liverpool, and if he knew 3 words of Welsh at the age of 7, that was about it. But the important thing was that my grandfather realized that the information that was written there was known to only 2 people. One was him, and the second was a relative of his who died several years before. And again, showing the sort of analytical mind that he had, he thought, well, now, if this really is my relative who's not with us anymore, and he's using my son to communicate, my son doesn't understand Welsh. So if I ask questions in Welsh, I get the right answers, then that'll be a good test. So that's what he did. And he asked several questions, and the answers were all correct and all written in Welsh. Now, the interesting thing was, as a result of that, he decided to leave the Methodist Church, and they joined what was then the Liverpool Psychological Society, which is what spiritualist organizations tended to be called then.
Yes.
But the interesting thing was my uncle, Robert, who subsequently became president of the union, he never went into trance again throughout the whole of his life. That was the one and only time that he was in trance by spirit. He became a very well-known speaker, and he was a healer who possessed what they called medical clairvoyance. In those days, it wasn't illegal for healers to prescribe to their patients, whereas now it is, of course. And he would, when he was treating a patient, he would see a medicine bottle in his mind's eye, and he could read what was on the label. And so he would write down the herbs that were written on that label, and he said, well, now you take this to the chemist, and I think you'll find it'll be just what you want for whatever the problem was this person had. Well, now, the interesting thing was that very often these herbs and things were tropical. They weren't herbs you could get in England. And in Liverpool, there has for many years been an excellent school of tropical medicine at the university. And so the chemist often used to refer his patients to the School of Tropical Medicine, and they got to know these patients quite well. Right. And they used to look at the prescription and say, well, what's wrong with you? And they would give their symptoms, and they'd say, well, this is exactly the sort of thing you need. And so eventually they got to know him and they said, oh, Mr. Owen sent you, did he? And so it went on. And as I say, he went on to become president of the union in 1926, I think. And he was president for 3 years. Then he was succeeded by a man called Ernest Keeling, who was, when I was a boy, he was president of Liverpool Dalby Spiritualist Church, and he named me when I was a baby. So I was named in the Spiritualist Church. And Ernest Keeling in 1948 became the first post-war president of the International Spiritualist Federation, an honor which I had many years later. So there's a lovely, some lovely links there between Ernest Keeling and myself. And you know, it really is the reason that I'm talking to you today. If it hadn't have been for my grandfather being the sort of man he was and following the instructions from my heart in Britain, we wouldn't be talking like this. You know, it's really very special. That is, I think.
Well, your family's influence and involvement is significant, isn't it? It's absolutely significant in the Spiritualist Union, in the movement itself.
Yes, well,
of course, your great aunt. She was for many years president of Dalby Church. She succeeded Ernest Keeling when he retired. And she was also treasurer of the union for several years. Yes. And was the centenary president of the Lyceum Union. And of course, we were all brought up in the Lyceum, or our whole family. I'm the only one who stayed with spiritualism as it worked out. I was going to ask.
But my 4 brothers and sisters, they were all brought up in the Lyceum. We all used to get on the tram every Sunday morning and trundle off to the Lyceum. And it's something that stayed with me. I mean, the teachings of the Lyceum, they're much neglected these days, I'm afraid. There are very few proper Lyceums going. And even my Aunt Gladys, in her latter years as president of Dalby, she ran an adult Lyceum. But I haven't heard of any children's Lyceums for years. But even now, when I'm speaking on the platform, I often find myself quoting something that I learned when I was in the Lyceum. It stayed with me, and it kept me in touch with spiritualism over the years. I mean, when I first moved
away from home to join the services because we had conscription then, I made it a point of finding out where there was a lyceum near to where I was stationed. And the first, although I was stationed for a little while in Blackpool, I didn't go to the Blackpool church because it was a training place and you couldn't get away very much.
Mm-hmm.
But then I was stationed in Norwich, and that was in 1952, and that began my association with the Norwich Church, which I maintain to this day.
Yes.
And it's wonderful, really. I went along to help with the Lyceum, and they were very pleased to have me. And in fact, my first experience of public speaking was then because Mr. Duffield, who was then the president of Norwich Church, asked me, they had a Lyceum Sunday once a year, and he asked me at that service to talk about the Lyceum. So, that, you know, I was the ripe old age of 19 then, I think, and there was me trying to explain to people what the Lyceum was all about. And then I moved to Cardiff, and in Cardiff, I did the same thing. I went along to Park Place Church in Cardiff and helped out with the Lyceum and made a lot of friends there and had an incredible experience, because once a year, a physical medium called Alec Harris, who is quite famous, he was a Cardiff man. And once a year, he used to give a special seance to members of the Lyceum. And so I was privileged to be invited along on this Sunday. Well, I can't remember what day of the week it was, but I was invited along to this seance. Well, I suppose it would be in 1964, I suppose. Mm-hmm. And it's an experience I'll never forget. The first thing I have to say is I've never felt so much reverence as there was in that circle. It's as though we were in the presence of God from the moment that we sat down. And then, you know, Alec Harris was sitting in the cabinet, tied to his chair. And after a while, the curtains blew up. The great wind came through the place. The curtains blew out horizontally. Yeah. And you could see Alec Harris there. And then the materialized form started to appear. There was one of his guides was a Native American Indian, and he was a big fella. Now Alec Harris was a typical Welshman. He was about 5'6", you know. And this great big American came out, and he invited one of the youngsters who were there to hit him on the chest, just to show that he was solid. Yes. And he did. He said, no, you can do it harder than that. So the boy gave him a real thump, and you could hear it. You know, you could hear it in the circle. And then, not long before the seance ended, my paternal grandmother, who died in 1947, I think. 1943. Yeah. She materialized full form and came over and held my hands. And it was such a marvelous experience. And of course, being 19, I thought, wow, this is fantastic. I shall experience this regularly. You know, yes. Never happened again.
No.
But you don't need that sort of thing more than once. And it was really fantastic. And I'm always going to be indebted to the Lyceum at Cardiff for that experience. It really was very, very special indeed.
So as you started to work, and I know that you didn't work within spiritualism full time when you were a younger man, how did you fit everything in, Lionel?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I started developing, my parents moved from Liverpool to Watford. My father's job took him down there. And we went along to the church there. And my father, when I was 16, enrolled me in a development circle with a lady in a place called Carpenter's Park, which is near Watford. And it was there that I first started to develop trance mediumship.
Right.
And she encouraged me. And then when I got to Norwich 2 or 3 years later, some people who became very dear friends there invited me to join their home circle. And again, the trance came. But it was there that I had a very interesting, well, it's more than interesting, it's an experience that I didn't realize the significance of until I met Gordon Higginson many years later. And at that time, one of the people who used to control me was German.
Okay.
Ironic, isn't it? Because I'm married to a German now. But my friends, with the best of intentions, invited a friend of theirs along who understood German. And now they clearly believed that there's only one form of trance, and that's unconscious trance, where the medium has no idea of what's going on. But I learned from Gordon Higginson later that there's different levels of trance. Mm-hmm. And the more common one is when the medium is quite aware of what's going on, which makes it all the more difficult because you know, your conscious mind keeps wanting to chip in. But anyway, this man started talking to me in German when I was under control, and I just panicked, you know. And of course, they then thought I was putting it on, and I never worked in trance again until when Laura and I moved to Stoke, and we eventually set up a home circle, and it started again. And I had a lot of encouragement at that time from Gordon, who held a trance workshop during my early days at Longton. And he explained this situation about the fact that not all trance is unconscious trance. And it helped me a lot. And he held a conversation with one of my guides, and he said to me afterwards what a pleasure it was to talk to him. And it really encouraged me, as he did, of course. It was Gordon who got me onto the platform.
Yeah.
Because you'll probably remember, Kath, that on the first Sunday of each year was President's Sunday, and the president chose who should be on the platform.
Yeah.
Well, one year he chose me to work with him. First time working on the platform, and you've got Gordon there. Petrified, but I have to say that the feeling of support that I, all the time I was on the platform, it was as though I was surrounded with Gordon's upliftment and his encouragement, and you know, it worked quite well, and he asked me to do the same again the following year, working with Glyn Edwards that time.
Yeah.
So you know, that started me off. Clearly, Gordon could see that I had people working with me in spirit who would help me to be a reasonably good speaker, and you know, that's how it all got started, really. Although you asked me about how did I fit everything in, and of course, when I have to explain, first of all, that I had more than 20 years away from spiritualism altogether.
Yeah.
Because my first wife she was frightened of spiritualism. And so you know, I had nothing to do with it for virtually 25 years. And then, you know, Laura introduced me to spiritualism again, because her grandfather had mentioned about staying, when he first went to America, about staying with a family of spiritualists. And she was fascinated to hear about it, and I explained. And so we started going, first of all, to Kingston Spiritualist Church in London, because I was then working in Guildford. And, then it was just a matter of going to the church once a week. And that was okay, because I was quite busy in my work then. And then after a few years, I was transferred to Leek, to the head office of the company I worked for. And that's when I first went along to Longton Church. Yeah. And of course, I met Gordon. Now, what Gordon wouldn't have known is that I first saw Gordon in 1946. He was working at the Picton Hall in Liverpool, and my parents took me along to see the demonstration. And that was just after he was demobbed from the army. And, I had to wait all those years to meet him again. My work at Leek was, pretty busy one way and another. And it wasn't easy to fit in, although my weekends by and large were mostly free. So after a while, once with the help of the home circle that I had, and then of Eric Thomas. Do you remember Eric?
I do remember Eric and Beryl.
With his encouragement as well, I started to work initially with a lady who was my namesake, Nan Owen, who was a member of his church. And we worked in most of the churches in the Potteries, and also at Crewe and one or two other places. But then eventually, Eric said to me, you really need somebody who's a better medium than the lady you're working with. And he knew somebody who needed somebody to speak with them. They couldn't do an address. And they worked with an aunt of theirs who was apparently, I never saw her, but apparently her talks were terrible. And so he introduced the two of us. So this was Joan Hughes. And we worked together for years, John and I. And we worked all over the East Midlands and the West Midlands. And it was at the weekends, but it also included some workshops as well. I do Saturday workshop and take the services on the Sunday.
Yeah.
And this is where the spirit photography came in. My uncle Robert, who I mentioned at the beginning, he was for quite a while a member of the famous Crewe Circle, which was the circle of William Hope, who was probably the best spirit photographer that Britain had ever seen. And as a result, he had a huge collection of William Hope's photographs, spirit photographs, which came to me ultimately from my Aunt Gladys after she passed. And so I decided that I would do some investigation into spirit photography, find out more about it, and use these photographs to talk about it. And that's how it happened. Eventually, I was able to transfer the photographs onto slides. I remember the first one I had the photographs pinned up on boards, it wasn't really so convenient. But somebody showed me how to make slides, and the lady who took over from my Aunt Gladys in Liverpool, she gave me a special table to put the projector on, and so that happened. And I also used to give some trance workshops as well. But as I say, it was mostly at the weekend or when I was on holiday. And of course, during this time, I was still developing. And mind you, we're developing all the time, aren't we? Let's face it. But I was still developing and going down to Stansted on a fairly regular basis. And also going to some weeks that Don Galloway used to run in Derbyshire, because that was nearby.
Yes.
Laura and I used to go to those weeks of Don Galloway. And, I met several mediums there who were helpful, including the last medium to be imprisoned for working on the platform. She was called Tekla Khan, and she was in her 90s then.
Wow.
And she was a great friend of my aunt's because she originally came from Liverpool, so they knew each other from there. And Tekla used to come to Longton Church occasionally, not to work, just to sit in the congregation, because a friend of hers from Manchester used to bring her along.
Right.
And Tekla, I remember her once telling me two things. One is that during the Second World War, a group of mediums got together when it looked as though there was nothing going to prevent an invasion of the British Isles from Germany. They used to meet every evening and throw a circle of light around the British Isles to prevent an invasion taking place. Now, the rationalists will say, oh, that's rubbish. I mean, it didn't happen because of this, that, and the other. But the fact is, they did that, and the invasion did not happen. Mm. The other thing was that she was at one of the talks I gave on spirit photography at Don's Week. And she told me afterwards that while I was giving the presentation, there was a group of people there from Spirit who had been brought along to learn what I was talking about. That their teachers in Spirit had brought them along so that they could learn about spirit photography. And I thought that was really touching, it was fantastic. But then I used to go to Stansted whenever I could, and particularly to Mavis Patilla's weeks, because by that time, I had to be very careful. I couldn't go as often as I wanted, and so on Mavis's week, it was her and Jill Harland and Marie Taylor, and they, they spent a lot of time and energy on me, and whatever gifts I've developed, they're very much to be blamed for it. Really, and I still am in touch with Mavis, but of course Jill sadly passed a few years ago, and I don't know whether Marie's still alive or not. I saw her a few years ago.
I think she might have passed last year, Lionel.
Oh, it could be. So that helped me a lot, and then Paul started up Longton Week, and I remember going there, and Glyn Edwards taking a hand in pushing me along and telling me to stop messing about and get on with it,
Yes, because when I went to Stansted, you and I were in the same group with Glyn's group, weren't we?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And I had a lot of time for Glyn. He, as I say, it was the second time I was on the platform at Longton was with Glyn.
Yes.
He was always very kind. He always called me my boy. I was 20 years older than him, but still. Always my
Never stopped him.
But that was great, and I'm indebted to all those people for their help and the guidance that they've given me, and it really. Once I retired, because I retired in 1993, then I had more time.
Yes.
And that's when I started to work more frequently and go to Stansted more frequently. And it was during that time that I was invited to be a tutor on Trance Week, experimental Trance Week, that was run by Leonard Young.
Yes.
And then when Leonard decided to move away from spiritualism, Judith, who was at that time, it was after Gordon had passed, Judith at that time was the principal of the AFC. She invited me to be the course organizer for that particular week.
Yes.
And it was wonderful. And I also used to help to organize the ISF, the International Spiritualist Federation weeks at Stansted as well, until the hall became too small. We had too many people; we couldn't fit them all in. That was special. Some of the highlights from those weeks, remembering Eileen Roberts and Ursula Roberts being there on the same week, and looking at the different ways they approached their mediumship. And Ursula, I remember she gave a wonderful talk on spiritualism in the Bible, and it was captivating. It really was absolutely fantastic. I'll never forget that. It was really good. And of course, Eileen, well, she was inimitable. She was an excellent teacher, very strict, and no messing about with Eileen. And lots of other people used to come along, and I got to know. I don't know what happened. I eventually became president of the International Spiritualist Federation when my predecessor, what's wrong with me? Anyway, he passed to spirit, and they quite, to my astonishment, they asked me to take over as president, and I was president for 9 years altogether.
Yeah.
It was a very interesting experience, working with people from all over the world. And of course, as a result, I was able to travel quite a bit. I'd already traveled a fair bit in the United States because Laura's family were over there, and we used to go to see them, and I would work in the church at Santa Barbara there. And gradually that expanded, and I remember being invited to Tokyo to the 50th anniversary of the Japan Psychic Science Association, which was really quite something. And their hospitality was quite astonishing. And I really, it was fascinating to watch how their mediums worked, because they worked quite differently from British mediums. And they would sit in meditation, and the mediums would go around and describe who they had with them. But invariably, it was an animal that they described. Now, that may seem strange, but in Shinto, which most of them, that was the religion they practiced. Spiritualism was not a religion to them. And in Shinto, animals have very significant very significant places, and the animal indicates the character of the people who were with you from spirit. So that's how I saw it. And then they asked me to demonstrate mediumship the way I did it.
Yes.
And it was going to become an annual thing where we had a group of people who would work with their mediums, and the group would work with me. And after 4 or 5 years, we would compare how the two got on. But unfortunately, along came the big crash in 1988 or whenever it was. And the Japanese couldn't afford to pay for me to go over to Japan anymore. So nothing came of that. But it was a fascinating experience to go there, and to go to other places in the world, and to work in the spiritualist camps in the United States, which are quite unique. There's no other country in the world that has these spiritualist camps, which really were that. They were originally camps in the summer. People used to take their tents along, and then mediums would be invited, and so on. And these days, they're permanent buildings. They're not tents anymore. But most of them still only meet in the summer. there are two no, there's only one that's open all the year round, and that's in Casadega in Florida. But I worked at 3 or 4 different camps, and it's an amazing experience, really, to feel the energy that's built up over years of this house, because you were working in the same building that people had worked in years before. And I also, talking about that, working in, it wasn't the same building, but I was invited to work at Rochester Church in New York State. And that was where spiritualism began. It was at Plymouth Spiritualist Church in Rochester. Now, the original church was pulled down, like Longton, because of road widening.
Yes.
There is and they invited me along, and the lectern that they had, this beautiful thing, was the same lectern that Arthur Conan Doyle had used when he came to speak to them in the 1920s. And it was, really quite something to think you were there speaking from the same lectern that he had used,
Yes.
And all sorts of things like that. Funny things as well, like one camp I went to in Massachusetts. I was taking the Sunday service, and 2 things happened. One was when the president had introduced me to give the address, he disappeared, and he whispered in my ear, he said, "I've just got to go down and check on the soup," he said. Down below was the sort of room where they all met after the service, and they always had something to eat, and he was in charge of the soup. So he disappeared. And then later, when I was giving the demonstration, I went to a lady and I described a young man that I had with me from Spirit, and he says, "Is your son?" And she said, no, it's not me, it's my friend, but she's nipped out for a smoke. I'll go and get her. Just hold on, he said. She said, there was me. I had to try and hold on to this contact while she went downstairs and got her friend and brought her back up. So, it's things like that that make you smile, and it really, I've been so lucky in the places I've been, the people I've met, and the people that I'm still in touch with in these places, even though I'm not able to visit anymore. And it really is. I've so much to thank Spirit and spiritualism for, that I can't begin to enumerate all the instances, but it's really fantastic. It is.
So are you enjoying retirement, Lionel, do you think?
I'm on that, sorry?
Are you enjoying retirement, do you think?
Retirement, yeah. Yes, I worked hard, traveled more after I retired than I did before. I wrote 3 books. Yeah. I've written quite a bit of poetry over the years, and it's amazing the way Spirit find ways to use you, and I never cease to be amazed. I look back and read some of the stuff that I've written, and I think, gosh, I can't believe it was me that wrote that. And of course it wasn't, because it was inspiration from Spirit that did that. And if it hadn't have been for spiritualism, I don't know how I would have coped with retirement, really, because I've been so busy during my business life that to suddenly find oneself at a loose end with nothing to do other than listen to music and go to the theatre or something like that, I think I would have gone mad, and I certainly wouldn't have lived to the ripe old age that I am now. And that's all down to Spirit. And what it shows me and what I say to many people is it's never too late. That it doesn't matter how old you are, if spirits have a role for you to play, if they want you to do something, if you put your hand in theirs, they will use you. And age is just a number. It doesn't matter at all. Mind you, I do find these days I have to ask to sit down rather than stand up very often.
That's fine.
But apart from that, I mean, I've really enjoyed being retired. I've been retired almost as long now as I worked for Britannia. I've been retired 26 years and I was with them for 31. So
Yes.
it's getting close.
Yes.
And bless them, the pension keeps coming in, thank goodness.
Well, that's all that matters, Lionel. That's all that matters. And I know that, you see, I very first started to go to Longton Church as a child. And then I had time away, education and different things. Came back, went away, came back. And when I came back, it would have been in the 90s. That's when I first saw you. And Laura, of course. And your involvement during that period was significant too, wasn't it? Because, of course, sadly, Gordon passed away and the whole stress and anxiety at that time was around the move, and which, of course, had been planned for 40-something years or something ridiculous like that. They knew that road was going to be coming through in the 60s, didn't they? They knew. And of course, the members then started to fundraise and save money for this move. So what was it like for you, Lionel, being involved during that very hectic time?
Well, Gordon asked me to be the liaison person between the architects and the builders and the committee on the rebuilding or the building of a new church. And of course, first of all, we had to find a site. And one or two sites were offered to us, and we eventually chose the one where you are now, which was in fact the site of a pub originally.
Yes.
They found the cellar when they were digging the foundations for the church. They found the remains of the cellar from the pub down there. I don't think there was any beer in there then, but and it was fascinating because it's reminded me that during that time, because it used to be frequent meetings with the builders and the architects. You know, I seemed to spend more of my time in Longton than I did at home. And I remember during that time going to an ISF meeting in Stansted when, oh dear, I made a note of her name, I knew I would forget, when Jean Skinner was giving a demonstration of transfiguration. And I remember distinctly, I was sitting next to Jean, and at one point she transfigured, and there was a big gasp from everybody there because they recognized Gordon. Gordon came and he spoke to me and gave me some advice as to what I should do about a particular problem we were facing with the building of the church at that time. And it was a marvelous experience, really. And I've always had a lot of time for Jean. She had quite a few detractors, unfortunately, but it wasn't justified. She was an excellent transfiguration medium. And you know, everybody recognized him. So that in itself is such a proof, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
And so that being there doing that, being vice president with Kath Jones, you remember Kath Jones, we were vice presidents together. And I always remember we were called out on one occasion to a pub where they'd had a haunting. That is in Newcastle. And I remember
we went along there and asked the landlord to explain what the problem was. And he said, well, it's down in the cellar. He said, there's a spot in the cellar where it's freezing cold, even though it's right next to the boiler that we use to heat the pub. He said, it's freezing cold there. And he said, on one occasion, I went down there and I was physically pushed away. I was thrust away. And so there was some physical presence there. And he said, I was scared to death. So, usually these physical events are triggered by something. They don't just happen out of the blue. So I said to him, can you remember if just before the time this happened, you had any trouble at the pub? And he said, oh yeah, I remember very well. He said, we had quite a sort of fight in the public bar. We had to call the police. And, there was a lot of violence. And I thought, well, that's it. That provided the energy for this person to make his presence known. So then Kath and I went downstairs into the cellar, and it's true. We could feel the cold. When you got to that point, it was freezing. It really was. And so I tuned in, and I know Kath did as well. And I tuned in, and my helpers came to me and said, this pub used to be an assize court way back. And the man who's causing this trouble was hanged there. He was a highwayman or a footpad, and he says he was betrayed by a friend, and he's held a grudge about that ever since, and he's been around the pub ever since he passed all those years ago. So I said to my helpers, I said, look, what sort of life did he have when he was here? Oh, it was terrible. He was an orphan, he was neglected, he didn't have any. I said, was there no love in his life at all? They said, no, the only thing he loved was a dog he had. And I said, well, is it not possible for you to show him that dog? If he loved that animal, maybe we can persuade him that he has moved on into spirit if he can see the dog, because he knew the dog had died.
Yes.
So they must have done that, because quite suddenly, within a minute, all the cold disappeared. Wow. And it was a normal temperature. And the pub didn't have any problems after that at all. And it is amazing the way these things happen, and how, people are so scared, understandably, but there's usually a good, solid reason for these things happening. That he was so angry, this guy, and he held on to that anger for 150 years because his friend had shocked him to the peeler or whoever they were. And, so that was quite an experience that Kath and I had together. And I was very fond of Kath. We used to get on very well.
You did. I remember.
Who was quite down to earth, no messing about with Kath. And I can remember Horace, her husband, going around when the new church opened. Still, about an hour before the Lord Mayor was due to come along and perform the opening, there he was going around screwing nameplates on the chairs where people bought a chair. That was wonderful. And of course, Kath asked me to scatter Horace's ashes at Stansted later on, and that was quite a privilege too.
Yes.
I got some wonderful memories of Longton, and Kath and I used to run a meditation group every Wednesday. I think every Wednesday morning in the library.
Yes.
And it was great. I enjoyed it. But all good things come to an end, and
it was necessary for me to move on. But I've always got a soft spot for Longton, and it's nice to come back and say hi.
We love seeing you, and of course there was a period of time where we didn't see you, and then you came back and took the services there, and almost everybody who sees you work, Lionel, is amazed at the emotion and the feeling and the real purpose of everything you do on the platform. From the opening prayer to the closing prayer, you bring the essence of God to the meeting, and that's, everybody says that. I'm not just saying that. Everybody does say that. And you know, these days, I think within our movement and within church services, there is a criticism that there is not enough good speakers. And I think we've got a lot of people at the moment watching on Facebook. There are a lot of people who recognise that you are one of the best, if not the best, speakers that we still have. If somebody's thinking, I can't do that, what would your advice be to start somebody on the road to becoming a good speaker?
Well, several things to do. First of all, get rid of any idea that you can't do it, because that's not true. We can all, it's amazing what we can do when we put our minds to it. But you have to prepare. Spirit will use you on the platform as a speaker, but they have to have something to work with. So you have to do your work as well. It's important to read good read some of the spiritual books. I don't mean spiritualist books. No. Read spiritual poetry, to listen to good speakers, not just spiritualist speakers, but good speakers, because the actual process of speaking can be taught. I know it's very true that there are certain basic principles you have to follow as a speaker. It doesn't matter what your subject matter is. There are certain things you need to do. And you have to remember that you're up there not representing you, but representing Spirit. And you put your hand in theirs. And provided you've done your homework, you've prepared yourself, you know what the basic skills are of giving an address, you know how to build it up, because it doesn't just happen. You need to have a structure to an address, and that can be learned, but it takes effort. And once you've done that, if you put your hand in the hand of the Spirit, you'll be amazed what happens. I mean, I can recall the occasions when I've been speaking, and I've sort of literally been carried away, and I've suddenly come to, and I realized that I was, prior to that happening, I was standing beside myself, watching myself speaking. It didn't happen very often, but it does happen sometimes when you are really attuned to the Spirit. And it is important. I mean, I've given messages to people from the platform where they've said to me afterwards, you brought my grandfather in, and the lady said, I couldn't believe it. You were my grandfather. For the time you gave me the message, you looked like him, you sounded like him.
Yes.
And that's when you get close to Spirit. Yeah. And you're not trying to do this type of mediumship, that type of mediumship. You're just getting close to Spirit. You're working with Spirit, and you're allowing them to dictate what's going to happen. It's trust. It's trust. It's knowing that if you've done your homework, then you can leave it to Spirit. Doesn't mean to say you shouldn't think about a forthcoming address. You should. You can be inspired the day before an address. You don't have to wait until the day itself. you can be inspired thinking about it during the week. You should turn over in your mind various topics you might be going to talk, and you'll find that one of them will come into focus more than the others, and that's the one you should be turning over in your mind. You shouldn't be writing it down and all that. Although, having said that, when I started off, I used to make notes. I used to have cards, and I'd write little notes on that I would use. And when I was working with Joan Hughes at one time, I was in the middle of an address and I dropped the cards. But I wasn't going to scrabble around on the floor. So and Joan said to me after, she said, "I saw someone from Spirit knock them out of your hand. You don't need them anymore," she said. You can trust the Spirit. But it's important when you start off to have some props, and there's nothing wrong with having notes. I never think you should read an address verbatim unless you've been given a very specific topic that has a lot of technical issues to it. Then you should have it written down. But otherwise, just general headings, just notes that you can refer to if you get stuck. And I often used to find I'd have these notes, and I realized when the address was over, I never looked at them. But it was a prop, it was an emotional prop for me to know, so that when you start off, that's a good thing. The terrible thing is I used to give workshops at Longton on speaking.
You did?
And would get 3 or 4 people, whereas Paul was holding a class on mediumship, and there were 20 there, you know. And there is a reluctance amongst a lot of people in spiritualism to try to become good speakers. And yet, if we're going to spread the message of spiritualism to people who are not spiritualists, it's the philosophy, it's the understanding, the meaning of spiritualism means far, far more than the evidence being brought from spirit. The evidence is important, and particularly to someone who's lost a loved one. But a lot of young people, for instance, in Norwich, we get a lot of university students coming along to the church. And it's important for them to learn what spiritualism is truly all about, what the belief is, what the philosophy is. Does it help me to understand my life better?
Yes.
Does it give me pointers as to how I should lead my life? These are the things that people are looking for, rather than hearing that Auntie Aggie is still as miserable in spirit as she was when she lived here. I don't wish to belittle messages, because I know how important messages have been. They brought many people into spiritualism. But I think the combination of the two, I mean, you mentioned about people kindly saying that my services are a sort of whole. And I think it's very important that there's no one part of a service that is more or less important than any other part. The opening prayer is just as important as the address, as the demonstration, as the closing prayer. And it's important that, mediums should try to have this wholeness, this completeness of a service. And you'll often find when that happens, whoever's doing the reading will have chosen a reading that fits in with what's being, what's happening in the rest of the service. And Spirit bring it all together. And then people go away thinking, oh, that was good. They feel uplifted. That's what a service should do, is uplift people. And you can only do that if you work hard and provide the basis that Spirit can use to provide this upliftment for everybody.
Mm-hmm. How do you see spiritualism now as opposed to when you were a boy?
Well,
progress or not?
It's certainly different. I mean, for a start, when I was a boy, there was very little international aspect of spiritualism at all. All the mediums that one saw were British mediums. You know, it was very rare to have anybody from overseas, and vice versa. It was very rare in those days for British mediums to go overseas. I mean, after all, you had to go on a boat in those days. There wasn't the jet planes, you know. So that there was that. Certainly, the evidential mediumship was far more in evidence then than I find it often is now. It's not true to say it's not there, but I think there's a lot more inexactness, you know, things that could be taken one or two or three ways now. And I think that's due to mediums' fear. Mediums are afraid of getting it wrong.
Uh-huh.
They allow that fear to come between them and the spirit people. And so instead of keeping on going back to the spirit and getting more and more information, they get the first lot and they try and make as much out of that as they can, and then they move on to the next person. But there's signs of hope. It's not all like that. There are some very good young mediums about in Britain and in the United States. I mean, I was really appalled when I first went to the United States and saw what passed for mediumship. You know, I remember, Laura will remember, we went to the Golden Gate Spiritualist Church in San Francisco.
Yeah.
And the person there, it was a Sunday afternoon service, I think, they just went round everybody that was there. So I got your grandfather here, I got your uncle here, I got your aunt here. There was no evidence whatsoever. And they all thought that was wonderful, you know. Oh, it's nice to know that my aunt's here, you know. There wasn't a shred of evidence at all. Now that's changing. People, you know, and I think, to be fair, the influence of the ISF and the international branch of the SNU have slowly begun to change the approach to mediumship in other countries, and particularly in the United States. And in Britain too, I think when I see some of the young mediums now, some of them are very good. Others, you know, I wish that we had presidents like my Aunt Gladys, who, when somebody came for the first time to the church, if they weren't very good, she would take them. She would sit in the audience. She wouldn't chair the meeting. She'd sit down. She'd take them into the medium's room afterwards, and she said, "Look, you're not quite ready yet for this. You need to go back into your development circle. Now, in 2 years' time, you give our medium secretary a ring, and we'll invite you again. But you must go back to your development circle." Now, how many, and I mean, it's not a criticism of you, Kath, but how many presidents would have the nerve to say that to a new person now? And it's equally, she would say it was very good if somebody was good, and said, "Well, book you again for next year." But I know mediums have come up to me over the years and they said, "I owe a huge debt of gratitude to your aunt, because she persuaded me to go back to develop further before I worked more on the platform." And you know, so it wasn't negative at all.
No, but not always taken in a positive light either, is it?
Well, that's
it's a difficult situation.
It's difficult. But having said that, there is hope. I mean, the SNU has changed a lot in recent years. I remember I went to the conference 2 years ago, and I was very impressed. You know, David has changed the emphasis in the conference so that we had a Sunday service without any demonstration of mediumship at all. And it was wonderful.
Yes.
You know, he had the courage to do that. And I think, you know, that's the sort of experimentation we should do. Spiritualism is still a very young religion.
Yes.
We're still very few in numbers. And I think whilst we should never lose the basis of what spiritualism is all about, we should be willing to experiment and look at different ways of getting the message across with the help of spirit.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that I did notice a few years ago, was that an increasing number of churches and to some extent the SNU were no longer asking spirit to help. They thought they knew best, and that's always a mistake. Spirit want to help, they will help, but if you don't want their help, then they won't give it. But you've got to be willing to accept that there is a power, an energy, a love there that we can all use, and it will lead to, it doesn't matter whether spiritualism becomes a huge body of a religion. What matters is the number of people we can help to lead a more meaningful life, to explain convincingly to people what we're here for. That's what spiritualism is all about. The whole object of proving that there's life after death is so that you can then carry the argument forward and say, okay, there is life after death, there's no death, so why are we here? What's the point of this life? It must be leading to something. There must be a reason that what we experience here in this life is important in the life that is to come.
Yes.
And therefore, we have the opportunity, whilst we're here, to do things in a way that we won't be able to do in the spirit world. When we don't have a physical body, there are certain things that we can't experience anymore. I know people have said that, they can't wait to get rid of this body and have the freedom of being in spirit, and that's wonderful. But there are advantages to the physical life, and there's a point in it. There's a reason for it, and and the recognition that we're not, that we're all part of, not only of one another, but of all other life. It's not, life is not just human life, and science has brought us many, many benefits, but it's also led to a polarization of our thinking, so that we tend to think, there's physical life, and then, well, if there's a spiritual life, that's something quite separate, which isn't. Everything's all of a piece. There's no separation. Everything is unity. And if spiritualists can help to bring people an understanding of that unity and give them a purpose to their life, then I think we've done a tremendous job. And to me, that's what mediums and teachers in spiritualism should be aiming to do, is to give people this firm understanding that life is not just something that happened by chance. Life has purpose, life has reason, and it also lasts forever, but not in the physical form. And so the physical form is important. We should enjoy it. We should do what we can. We should look after the physical vehicle that we've got, and we should also try to look after the spirit person we are too. And it's that combination, that bringing together of the spirit and the physical body in individuals, not just between the spirit world and ourselves.
Well, Gordon used to say that anybody who wanted to begin in any sort of development needed to develop self, and I know that it's been called to spiritualize oneself, and to know oneself, and to really understand who we are from the depths of our very being. And of course, I think that, I believe that is true, and I feel that some of what we see with psychic readings, people want something on a psychic level, doesn't go deep, does it? It doesn't touch you in a way that can change your life, like the power of the spirit can.
Yeah, that's true. And yet I think it's important to realize that mediums are people too. That there's a great tendency of people to assume that there's something very spiritual about a medium. It doesn't follow at all. But spirituality is not the same as mediumship. And spirituality is something which covers all religions. And I think it's a mistake to think of being spiritual as being holier than thou and being so soft and quiet and never a crossword and so on. That to me is not being spiritual.
No,
but it's an idea that gets put across very often, and I think although the New Age people of some years ago now did do quite a bit towards bringing attention to spiritualism, I think in many ways they've held it back as well, because it's too it doesn't go deep enough, as you said. It's too superficial, and we must avoid that. But then we must also avoid making saints of our mediums and pretending or being convinced that they're so spiritual, because we're not. And we just have a gift that enables us to bring the two worlds together in certain ways. And it's a wonderful gift, but it's no greater a gift than the gift to be able to do a good painting, to write a story, to make a lovely piece of furniture. These are all gifts which have a spiritual dimension. And we've got to get away from this idea of compartmentalizing everything. We should look upon it all as a wonderful whole. As, going back to my Lyceum days, the first silver chain recitation in the Lyceum manual is a quotation from Alexander Pope's essay on man: all are but parts of one stupendous whole, whose body nature is and God the soul. And that's what spiritualism is about, is bringing people to an understanding, a conviction that is true, that it's not just words, that it is the truth. And that way we will learn to treat everyone. I mean, living as I do now in South Africa, where there's such huge differences between the haves and the have-nots. It brings it home to you, really. And yet very often the togetherness that poor people have in their terrible communities is often far more wonderful than what you have in the well-to-do communities. And I think that those are the sort of things that we need to think on and consider, what are we losing and what could we gain? And, how can we help without destroying some of the good things that were there in the first place?
Yes.
I mean, that's what life's all about. It's full of challenges. And we get it wrong more often than we get it right. But it's those few times we get it right that make it all worthwhile.
Yes. And the times when we don't get it right are the times when we learn so much, aren't they, of course?
Absolutely. Yes, it is true that it's
Lionel, if you could book a table tomorrow, of course we can't book a table and go to a restaurant anywhere at the moment. If you could have a meal with 3 people who you would really love to sit and have a chat with, who would those 3 people be, whether they're still here physically or whether they're now in the spirit world?
Woo. Well, now then. Well, I think they'd all be in the spirit world because
Okay.
nearly as well. So, and I would think I'd love Arthur Conan Doyle to be one of them.
Okay.
Arthur Conan Doyle. I'd love to be with Alec Harris again because I never really got to know him very well, and his contribution to my life was out of all proportion to the small amount of time that I spent with him. So I'd like him to be there. And then the third one, it is much more difficult to come to an actual conclusion as to whether it should be somebody like Gordon, who I have enormous respect for, or whether it should be somebody outside the spiritualism altogether, and somebody like Pythagoras, one of the ancient Greek people, because I think they knew so much that we don't know. But if I were to add a fourth, I would say it would be William Wordsworth.
Right.
Because I love William Wordsworth's poetry, and so much of it is about what we believe.
Yes.
With the intimations of immortality, for instance, is a marvelous poem. It really is, and it just says what we believed. That
Yes.
it's the business about we come from a glorious place, and as we spend more time on the earth, so the memory of that glorious place gets fainter and fainter. And it's so, I think probably if I had to restrict it to three, I'd replace Alec Harris with William Wordsworth.
Okay. It would be difficult just to pick three, really, wouldn't it? And for anybody. But time has almost caught us up, and lots of people have made some wonderful comments. I would just ask you, Lionel, if you have advice for anybody at this moment in time who is struggling with what is going on in the world and how their lives and all our lives are turning out to be, what would your advice be?
Change is inevitable. We need to adapt to change, embrace change, and make sure that the opportunities that change brings us to make improvements is grasped. That we don't just, when everything's all over, go back to what everything was like before. So change, life is change, and it's just that some changes are more dramatic than others, and this is one of those. But we will get through it. We will learn from it, or we should learn from it. And I believe we should remember what we experienced ourselves during this time inside. I don't mean what we experienced on the surface, but what we experienced deep inside. The peace, the tranquility. Yes, that's not true for everyone, but I think it's true for a lot more people than you'd think. And how important that felt at the time. So try to create, when things go back to normal, try to create opportunities where you can experience that inner peace again.
Thank you. It's been lovely to talk to you. Will you just stay there just a moment? Thank you to everybody on Facebook for tuning in. I'm sure you'll be able to replay it back at some point. Thank you. I think I've stopped on Facebook.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Kath.
No, it said I was still going when I was saying I think I've stopped. Well, thank you, Lionel. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you, and thank you for joining me today.